From the devastating plane crash that killed hundreds, to his calculated manipulation of Jesse, to the poisoning of Lydia, Walter White left a staggering body count in his rise to power. Over Breaking Bad's 5 seasons, Walt was responsible for 200 deaths, whether by his own hand or as a consequence of his actions. In this video, we're going to cover every single person he killed. Walter White's first killed was Emilio Koyama, an unsuspecting low-level meth distributor caught in Walt's transformation into Heisenberg. Emilio had been arrested during a DEA raid, but when he made bail, he wrongly assumed that his former partner, Jesse Pinkman, had ratted him out. Furious and seeking revenge, Emilio forced Jesse to arrange a meeting with Walt, dragging along his cousin, Domingo Crazy 8 Molina. The meeting quickly turned hostile when Emilio recognized Walt from the DEA bust, leaving him convinced that Walt was an informant.
Hey, I know you. He was there when I got busted. He's with the DEA. No. You rata snitch, motherfucker.
Surrounded and desperate, Walt proposed to teach them his meth cooking technique in exchange for his life. Inside Jesse's RV, Walt carefully set the stage. As Emilio and Crazy 8 watched closely, Walt caused a chemical reaction, releasing toxic phosphine gas into the air. He darted outside and sealed the door, trapping both men inside as the lethal fumes took hold. Emilio succumbed quickly, his body left lifeless on the RV floor. In the immediate aftermath, Jesse was left in shock, while Walt, shaken but composed, took the first step on a dark and irreversible path. Emilio's gruesome death forced Walt to cover his tracks, leading to the infamous bathtub scene and marking the first in a deadly trail he would leave behind. The second person Walter White killed was Domingo Crazy 8 Molina, a small-time drug dealer who became Walt's first true test of moral compromise. Before his death, Crazy 8, like Emilio, was a mid-level meth distributor in Albuquerque, working alongside his cousin. After Emilio succumbed to Walt's phosphine gas trap, Crazy 8 survived, but sealed his fate when he tried to escape. Walt and Jesse restrained him in the basement, chaining him to a pole with a bike lock. While Jesse was tasked with dissolving Emilio's remains, Walt was left with the responsibility of deciding whether Crazy 8 would live or die. For days, Walt struggled with the weight of taking a life.
So I should just let you go then? Just unlock you and adios, huh?
I don't see what real choice you have.
He fed Crazy 8, spoke with him, and even began to convince himself that letting him go was the right choice. But when Walt discovered that Crazy 8 had hidden a broken shard of a plate, clearly intending to kill him once freed, he realized he had no choice. With shaking hands and tear-filled eyes, he pulled the bike lock tight, choking Crazy 8 until his body went limp. In the aftermath, Walt was visibly shaken, apologizing to the lifeless body before disposing of it. This moment marked the irreversible turning point in his transformation. Walter White had now truly crossed the line into the world of murder, and it only gets darker from here. Although Walter didn't kill Jane Margulis, his decisions to let her die was just as chilling. Jane was Jesse Pinkman's girlfriend, a recovering addict who relapsed and pulled Jesse deeper into heroin use. Their relationship became a problem for Walter when Jane blackmailed him into handing over Jesse's share of the drug money. That night, Walt followed through, delivering the cash, but Jane made it clear she could never be trusted to stay silent. With Jesse slipping further into addiction, Walt saw Jane as a dangerous influence, one that needed to be removed. Later that night, Walt broke into Jesse's apartment when he was trying to get in contact with him. Jesse and Jane were passed out from heroin, and as Walt tried to wake Jesse, Jane shifted onto her back. Seconds later, she began choking on her own vomit. Walt froze, horrified as she struggled for air. He moved forward instinctively as if to help, but then stopped himself. Watching her die, he let silent tears fall, his face filled with guilt and cold calculation. The next morning, Jesse woke up to find Jane lifeless beside him. His frantic attempts to wake her were useless. Broken and spiraling into despair, he blamed himself for her death. By now, Walt has shed any remnants of his former self, seeking lives as mere obstacles in his path. Letting Jane die marked one of his last moments of guilt as silent tears fell, one of the final traces of the man he used to be. But the real weight of her death didn't fall on Jesse alone. It fell on Jane's grieving father, which brings me onto the next deaths Walter was responsible for. The collision of the Wayfarer 515 and the JM21 was a catastrophic chain reaction set in motion by Walter White's ruthless choices. Though he never intended for 167 people to die, his decision to let Jane Margulis overdose sent ripples far beyond his own world. Jane's father, Donald Margulis, was an air traffic controller, a man responsible for the safety of countless passengers. After losing his daughter, he returned to work too soon, emotionally shattered and barely holding himself together. His grief clouded his judgment, leading to a devastating miscalculation. That night, as two planes crossed paths in the sky over Albuquerque, Donald, distracted and overwhelmed, gave incorrect instructions. Wayfarer 515, a commercial airliner, and JM-21, a small charter plane, collided in mid-air, erupting into fire and debris. Walt, sitting in his backyard, watched in silent horror as the wreckage rained down, luggage and bodies plummeting from the sky. A charred pink teddy bear, a haunting symbol of innocent lives lost, landed in his pool. The disaster shook the city, leaving residents mourning the inexplicable loss. Donald, crushed by guilt, attempted suicide. Meanwhile, Walt showed no remorse, delivering a chilling speech downplaying the tragedy. But deep down, he knew the truth. His sins had consequences far beyond his control. Walt's next two kills came in Season 3 when he brutally eliminated two rival dealers, taking matters into his own hands in a shocking act of violence that reshaped his criminal empire. These dealers had been a persistent problem, operating under Gus Fring and using children, including 11-year-old Tomas Cantillo, to carry out executions and sell drugs. Jesse Pinkman, fueled by guilt and anger over the murder of his friend Combo, refused to let their actions go unanswered. Despite Gus intervening and ordering them to stop using children, the dealers retaliated by executing Tomas, drawing Jesse to the brink of an all-out confrontation. Jesse, armed and determined, approached the dealer's car, ready to die in a shootout. But before the standoff could escalate, Walter White's Pontiac Aztek came barreling into the scene. In a split second, Walt crushed one dealer under his tires while sending the other flying. Without hesitation, he stepped out of the car, grabbed the wounded dealer's gun, and executed him with a single shot to the head. Jesse stood in silence as Walt, now fully Heisenberg, revealed his true nature.
Run.
What happened after was swift and deadly. Jesse went into hiding, and Gus, in rage, saw Walt as a liability. This moment solidified Walt's willingness to kill to protect his interests, marking the beginning of a violent power struggle between him and his employer, one that could only end in bloodshed. And keep watching because we'll get onto that. The next person Walter killed was another proxy murder. Gil Bedeker, a brilliant but naive chemist, became a threat when Gus Fring prepared him to replace Walt. With Jesse in hiding, Gus reinstated Gale, urging him to master Walt's formula, making Walt expendable. Realizing his life was on the line, Walt devised a desperate plan. As he arrived at the industrial laundromat, he was met by Mike Ehrmantraut and Victor, who prepared to execute him. Thinking quickly, Walt begged to make a phone call, pretending to arrange a meeting with Jesse. Instead, he used the opportunity to tip Jesse off, frantically ordering him to kill Gale before Gus could eliminate them both. Mike seized the phone, but the damage was done. Jesse had his orders. That night, as Gale hummed along to his music and prepared tea, Jesse arrived at his door, gun trembling in his hands. Gale pleaded for his life, offering money, anything to be spared.
Please, don't do this. You don't have to do this.
But with no way out, Jesse, teary-eyed and shaking, pulled the trigger. Walt's gamble had worked. Gale's death forced Gus to keep him alive, but it also escalated the war, pushing him further into ruthless, calculated violence. Something which we'll get onto now, but first I want to remind you to subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Anyways, let's get back to it. The next time Walt killed was when his bomb claimed 3 lives at once. Hector Salamanca, Gustavo Fring, and Tyrus Kidd all perished in a single devastating explosion, an expertly planned strike by Walter White to eliminate his most formidable enemy. For years, Gus had ruled the meth empire with precision and ruthlessness, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. Walt, once a pawn in his operation, had become a liability. Knowing his days were numbered, Walt sought an unlikely ally, Hector Salamanca, a bitter and vengeful old man with nothing left to lose. Paralyzed and mute, Hector had long been tormented by Gus, who relished in his helplessness. But despite his physical limitations, Hector still had one weapon: his hatred. Walter rigged Hector's wheelchair with a pipe bomb, turning him into a living trap. To lure Gus in, Hector staged a betrayal, requesting a DEA meeting, knowing the news would reach him. As expected, Gus took the bait, arriving at the nursing home to kill Hector himself. Face to face with his old nemesis, Gus mocked him one last time, unaware that Hector's relentless bell ringing wasn't a tantrum, it was the trigger. In an instant, the explosion engulfed the room, killing Hector, Tyrus and leaving Gus mortally wounded. In an eerie moment, Gus stepped out of the room, adjusting his tie before collapsing, half of his face missing. The Kingpin was dead, and with him, Walt's biggest obstacle. The explosion sent shockwaves through Albuquerque's underworld, leaving a power vacuum. Walt, now free from Gus's grasp, had secured his place at the top. The war was over.
Was this you? What happened?
I won.
Did anyone else think that Gus had somehow survived this, or was it just me? And if you thought that he lived too, let me know in the comments below. Although Gus was dead, Walt still had unfinished business. In a final act of defiance against the empire that nearly consumed him, he killed 2 more men. Following Gus Fring's explosive demise, Jesse was still trapped in the super lab, forced to continue to cook under the watchful eyes of Gus's remaining enforcers. With Gus gone, his men were still dangerous, still loyal, and still standing in Walt's way. To ensure his complete victory, Walt had to eliminate them. Inside the super lab, Jesse worked under the threat of gunpoint, handcuffed to a piece of equipment. But the moment the elevator doors slid open, everything changed. Walt, gun in hand, took them by surprise. In a split second, he fired, killing both men in cold blood. One collapsed instantly, and the other barely had time to react before dropping lifelessly to the floor. With the threat eliminated, Walt freed Jesse and set the lab ablaze, ensuring Gus's empire would be reduced to ash. The final shots marked the true transformation of Walter White into Heisenberg, not just a man fighting for survival, but one who would destroy anyone who would stand in his way. Walt's next victim was Mike Ehrmantraut, the calm and calculating enforcer who met his end in one of the show's saddest moments, killed in a sudden fit of Walt's rage. For years, Mike had been the man who had kept things in order, the steady hand who ensured the operation ran smoothly. After Gus Fring's death, he attempted to move on, securing the future of his imprisoned men and his beloved granddaughter Kaylee. But Walt, unwilling to relinquish control, refused to let Mike simply walk away. As the DEA closed in on Mike's associates, Walt demanded their names. Mike refused, knowing he never should have trusted Walt in the first place. Their final confrontation was not part of some grand plan, but a moment of pure frustration. As Mike prepared to leave, Walt, seething with resentment, pulled a gun and shot him. The gravity of his actions hit him immediately. He didn't need to kill Mike. The information he wanted could have been obtained elsewhere. Sitting on a log, staring at the water, Mike accepted his fate. As Walt stumbled over an apology, Mike silenced him with his final words.
This whole thing could have been avoided.
Shut the fuck up. Let me die in peace.
His death marked the end of an era, the last remnant of the old ways gone, and Walt, now completely untethered, had no one left to hold him back. What was so sad about this death was Mike was such a great character, and he really did not need to die. And if you thought that this was brutal, well, the next deaths Walt orchestrated were even more shocking. The next people Walt killed were 10 of Gus Fring's former employees, executed on his orders to cover his tracks and ensure no loose ends could threaten his empire. With Mike Ehrmantraut dead and Jesse out of the game, Walt still had one major problem: Gus's old associates, who were in prison and can easily turn on him. The DEA was pressuring them, and Walt couldn't afford to take any risks. If one of them talked, the entire empire he had built would collapse. Meeting with Jack Welker, Walt laid out his demands. Every single man had to die, and it had to happen within a 2-minute window to prevent law enforcement from intervening. What followed was a series of brutal, calculated killings. Prison cells became execution chambers as men were stabbed, burned, and strangled in perfect synchronization. As the clock ticked down, Walt sat at home, calmly watching the second hand move, waiting for confirmation. When Jack finally called, Walt barely reacted, just a small nod and 2 words.
Yes, it's done.
The massacre sent a clear message: Walter White was untouchable. With no one left to betray him, he has solidified his reign as Heisenberg, a king with no rivals. But while the killings ensured his immediate safety, they also revealed how far he had fallen. This was no longer about survival, it was more. It was about absolute power. I wonder if you find this a bit unrealistic. I mean, I don't know if this could actually be pulled off in real life, because there's just so many things that could go wrong. So let me know down below, and of course remember to subscribe. Hank Schrader and Stephen Gomez died as a consequence of Walt's desperation, though for once, he never intended for it to happen. After uncovering undeniable proof that Walt was Heisenberg, Hank lured him into the desert with the help of Jesse, setting the stage for a final confrontation. With no way out, Walt called Jack Welker's gang, hoping to intimidate Jesse, unaware he had just signed his brother-in-law's death warrant. By the time Jack and his men arrived, the standoff had already begun, leading to a violent shootout. Gomez was the first to fall, gunned down in the crossfire, his body left lifeless beside Hank. With no ammunition left, Hank was forced to face Jack alone. Walt pleaded for his life, offering his entire fortune in exchange, but Hank knew that there was no escape.
Do what you're gonna do.
A single gunshot ended his life, and Walt collapsed, devastated. This moment shattered whatever humanity he had left, marking the death of Walter White, the man, and the full emergence of Heisenberg, a kingpin who had destroyed everything he once claimed to protect. In the long run, this cost Walt the only thing he had left, his family, leaving him with nothing to lose, which fueled his ruthless plotting for the rest of Season 5. Jack Welker's gang was a ruthless group of neo-Nazis who have terrorized, tortured, and murdered for their own gain. But in the end, they never saw Walter White's final play coming. After months in exile, Walt returned to Albuquerque with a single objective: to eliminate Jack and his men. Knowing he was outgunned, he devised a plan that would wipe them out in one swift strike. Pretending to negotiate a deal, Walt met with Jack at the gang's compound, his truck packed with a M60 machine gun rigged to fire remotely. As Jack Men's mocked Walt and dragged out a beaten, shackled Jesse, Walt seized the moment, tackling Jesse to the ground and hitting the car remote. In an instant, the truck popped open and the M60 roared to life, unleashing a hail of bullets through the walls of the compound. Kenny, Matt, Frankie, Lester, and 2 other gang members were cut down before they had time to react. When the smoke cleared, Jack laid mortally wounded, and Todd had barely survived. With his last ounce of strength, Jesse strangled Todd, while Walt, mortally wounded, watched. However, Jack Welker, the gang's leader, still remained. After orchestrating a brutal massacre that wiped out Jack's gang, Walt stood over a wounded Jack, who desperately tried to buy his life with the only bargaining chip he had left: Walt's stolen millions.
You want your money, right? Huh? You wanna know where it is? You pull that trigger, you never do.
But Walt had already lost everything that mattered. Jack barely got the words out before Walt pulled the trigger, shooting him in the head mid-sentence. The execution mirrored Jack's own ruthless killing of Hank, a fitting end for a man who had prided himself on his brutality. This was fitting. After all the deaths Walt caused for money and power, he no longer cared about either. As Jack's lifeless body slumped against the wall, Walt barely acknowledged him, his focus already elsewhere. This wasn't about survival or empire building anymore. It was about revenge. With Jack dead, Hank and Gomez were finally avenged, another piece of unfinished business settled. In that moment, there was no Heisenberg, no desperate man grasping for control, just a husband, a father, and a broken man making sure his last enemy fell before he did. Walter White's final act of vengeance reached Lydia Redart Quayle, a high-strung and calculating business executive whose ties to the meth trade made her a liability in his eyes. Lydia built her empire behind the scenes, using Magical Electromotive's logistics network to facilitate the distribution of Walt's signature blue meth. After his disappearance, she aligned herself with Jack Welker's gang, hoping to maintain her operation. Paranoid and ruthless, she was always one step away from eliminating anyone she deemed a threat, including Walter himself. Walt anticipated Lydia's treachery and decided to strike first. Knowing her meticulous routine, he approached her at her usual cafe meeting spot. She ordered her signature chamomile tea, sweetened with stevia, unaware that Walt had laced it with a fatal dose of ricin. As she conspired with Todd Alquist to have him killed, she unknowingly sealed her own fate. That night, after Walt's massacre of Jack's gang, Lydia called Todd for confirmation, only to hear Walt's voice instead. With cruel finality, he informed her of the poison coursing through her veins.
How are you feeling? Kind of under the weather? Like you've got the flu? That would be the ricin I gave you.
Later, a news report that an unnamed Houston woman was hospitalized in critical condition with no expectation of survival. Lydia's death was the final loose end, tied up with cold precision. The final person Walt killed was himself. As I mentioned, the final person Walt killed was in fact himself, a fitting end to a monster. When the bullets stopped flying from the trap Walt had set for Jack and his men, nearly everyone in the room was dead, except Jesse, whom Walt had shielded from the gunfire. But in a cruel twist of fate, a stray bullet had found its way into Walt's abdomen, marking the beginning of his own end. His journey to this moment had been paved with blood, deception, and an insatiable hunger for control. Once a desperate chemistry teacher, he had become the ruthless Heisenberg, leaving destruction in his wake. But as he stood in the aftermath of the massacre, looking at Jesse one last time, there was no Heisenberg left, just a dying man who, in his own way, had finally set things right. As Jesse sped away to freedom, Walt stumbled into the meth lab, the birthplace of his empire. Surrounded by the equipment that had defined his second life, he took one last look before collapsing, his reflection smeared in blood. Moments later, the police arrived. They found Walter White, but Heisenberg was gone. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and stick around for more Breaking Bad content.